Her husband sold their house, mocking her. But when she returned, he was trembling in fear. The conference room was filled with the low hum of voices as she gathered her notes, preparing to wrap up her final client meeting of the day. Just as she reached for her coffee, her phone buzzed on the table. A familiar number. Her husband. She sighed, expecting the usual check-in. Maybe he needed something from the grocery store, or perhaps he was just bored. But as soon as she answered, the tone in his voice sent a chill down her spine. "I'm divorcing you," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Before she could even process his words, he continued, "And by the way, I sold the house. Hope you enjoy looking for a new place." Then, a cruel laugh echoed through the receiver. For a moment, her brain refused to catch up with reality. Divorce? Sold the house? None of it made sense. They hadn't even discussed separation, and now he was claiming their home was gone? The sheer audacity of it was almost laughable. Her grip on the phone tightened, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "You sold the house?" she asked, keeping her tone even, despite the chaos roaring in her mind. "Yep," he said, the smugness in his voice palpable. "Needed the money for my new life. You know, with someone who actually deserves me." Her stomach twisted. So that was it. There was someone else. She had suspected it for months, his late nights, his sudden work trips, the distant way he looked at her lately. But to hear it so openly, with such cruelty, made her chest tighten. He had already moved on, and worse, he had taken their home with him. Not just a house. Their house. The place they had built together. The place she had loved. And now, he had thrown her away like she was nothing more than a nuisance. She inhaled deeply, refusing to let him hear the pain in her voice. "All right," she finally said, her voice neutral. There was silence on the line for a second, as if he hadn't expected that response. "All right," he echoed, almost irritated. "Yeah," she replied. "If that's what you want." And then she hung up, not giving him the satisfaction of hearing another word from her. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, but her mind was already shifting. The rage, the sadness, the betrayal, they would have to wait. She needed answers. Because there was one very important thing her soon-to-be ex-husband didn't know. She stepped out of the office building, the evening air crisp against her skin. The city lights flickered around her as she hailed a cab back to the hotel where she was staying for work. Every beat of her heart echoed with the same thought: how had he managed to sell the house without her consent? She had handled most of their financial paperwork, but she knew he was reckless, the kind of man who skimmed over documents and signed things without reading them. Maybe he had forged her signature. Maybe he had found a loophole. Either way, she was going to find out. The ride back to her hotel felt endless, her mind racing through every possibility. She scrolled through her emails, searching for anything related to their property. That's when she found it, an old email from their lender. A few months ago, they had refinanced the house to secure a better interest rate. And during that process, after consulting a financial advisor, she had done something that her husband clearly hadn't remembered: she had transferred the deed to her name alone. The realization settled over her like a storm cloud ready to burst. He thought he had sold their home. He thought he had taken everything from her. But he had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. She sat on the hotel bed, rereading the deed transfer documents, a slow smirk forming on her lips. He really thought he had outsmarted her. He had laughed at her, mocked her, thinking he was throwing her out into the streets. But in reality, he had just sold something that wasn't his to sell. The thought of it made her anger settle into something much colder, calculated, controlled. Her fingers hovered over her phone before she finally called Chloe, her lawyer and longtime friend. "Hey," Chloe answered. "What's going on?" "My husband thinks he sold our house," she said, her voice eerily calm. There was a pause. "What do you mean, thinks?" Chloe asked. "I mean," she continued, gripping the edge of the bed, "that the house is legally mine, and he had no right to sell it." The line was silent for a second before Chloe let out a low whistle. "Oh, this is going to be good." And just like that, the battle had begun. The next morning, she checked out of her hotel and took the first flight home. As the plane soared through the clouds, she mentally prepared herself for what awaited her. There was no telling how far he had gone with the sale, whether he had already taken the money, whether the new owner had started moving in. But one thing was clear, he was in for the shock of his life. When she landed, she called Chloe again, who had spent the night digging into the legality of the situation. "So here's the deal," Chloe said. "Any money he took from a buyer is legally fraudulent. And as for the house? If he handed over keys to someone else, they have no legal right to stay there. You can call the police if needed." A slow, satisfied breath left her lips. Perfect. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove to a small cafe near their neighborhood, ordering a coffee while she reviewed everything. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about how easily he had discarded her, how he had laughed at her over the phone, thinking he had destroyed her life. Her husband had been careless, sloppy. And now, he was about to learn that the woman he had underestimated was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. She sat in the cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her mind racing through every possible scenario. How far had he gone? Had he already taken the money from the so-called buyer? And what about his new girlfriend? Did she know he had pulled this stunt? The more she thought about it, the more she realized something crucial: he had never been smart enough to execute something like this alone. He was reckless, impulsive, always acting without thinking things through. If he had managed to find a buyer, someone had helped him. And that someone was probably the woman he had left her for. She scrolled through her phone, searching for any clues. Their joint bank account had barely been touched in weeks, meaning the money from the supposed sale had to be somewhere else. A private account? A hidden stash? There were too many possibilities, but she knew one thing for certain: he had underestimated her. He thought she would cry, beg, and crumble under the weight of his betrayal. But he had forgotten who she was, forgotten that she was always one step ahead, even when he didn't realize it. And now, she was going to make sure he felt the full force of his mistake. She booked a room at a boutique hotel, deciding that returning home unannounced would be too easy. She wanted to observe first, to see how much damage he had already done. From the large window of her suite, she could see the skyline stretching out before her, an ironic metaphor for how her life had just been upended. But the thing about upheaval was that it brought opportunity, and she wasn't about to waste hers. Instead of wallowing in grief, she methodically made a list of everything she needed to do. Her first call was to a real estate agent she had worked with in the past, someone she trusted. "I need a favor," she said, keeping her voice cool. "I need to know if my husband has tried to sell my house, and if so, who the buyer is." There was a pause on the other end before the woman replied, "Give me a couple of hours." That was all she needed to hear. Hanging up, she exhaled, stretching her fingers over the keyboard of her laptop. If her husband thought she would just walk away quietly, he had another thing coming. As the hours passed, she met Chloe in the hotel lounge, their drinks untouched between them. "I did some digging," Chloe said, crossing her legs. "And you were right, he was sloppy. He didn't just try to sell the house, he actually went through with the deal. But here's the catch, the sale isn't final yet." That made her sit up straighter. "Why not?" she asked. Chloe smirked, enjoying the irony. "Because the buyer still needs a final signature from you to complete the process." Relief mixed with amusement as she realized just how badly her husband had screwed up. He had gone through all the motions, found a buyer, probably even bragged about it to his girlfriend, but in the end, he couldn't finish what he started. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her fingers tapping against her glass. "Now," Chloe said, leaning in, "we make sure he learns a lesson he'll never forget." She had always been careful when it came to legal matters, something her husband never understood. He had accused her of being paranoid, of overthinking things, but now that same paranoia had saved her. The refinancing had put the house in her name alone, making the sale legally impossible without her consent. As she scrolled through the documents on her laptop, she felt a sense of satisfaction bloom inside her. Chloe had already drafted the necessary letters to notify the so-called buyer that the deal was void. If her husband had accepted any money, he was in serious trouble. Fraud was no small matter, and if she played this right, he would have to answer for every last dollar he had taken. Smiling to herself, she closed her laptop. The game had only just begun. She didn't just want to win, she wanted him to feel every ounce of humiliation he had tried to inflict on her. And the best way to do that was to let him think, for just a little longer, that he had succeeded. If she showed her hand too soon, he might try to cover his tracks. No, she needed to wait, to let him revel in his so-called victory before pulling the rug out from under him. She spent the next few hours crafting a careful strategy. First, she would contact the buyer herself, making sure they understood exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Then, she would set up a meeting with her husband under the guise of discussing the divorce. He would walk into that meeting expecting to see a defeated woman. Instead, he would be walking straight into his own downfall. Her car sat idling outside their house, or what used to be their house. The lights were on, and for a moment, she considered marching inside, confronting him on the spot. But that wasn't her style. She had no interest in screaming matches or emotional breakdowns. Instead, she watched from a distance, noting every detail. A second car was parked in the driveway, an expensive one that she didn't recognize. His girlfriend's, no doubt. She leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. He thought he had taken everything from her. He thought he had moved on, free and untouchable. But what he didn't know was that his entire world was about to come crashing down. And she was going to enjoy every second of it. She scheduled a meeting with the buyer for the following morning, choosing a neutral location, a law office downtown. The man who showed up was younger than she expected, mid-30s, well-dressed but visibly annoyed. He clearly didn't appreciate being called in for a discussion about a deal he thought was already settled. "Look," he said, running a hand through his hair, "if this is some last-minute attempt to renegotiate." She cut him off with a small smile. "Actually," she said, sliding a folder across the table, "the sale was never legal to begin with." His brow furrowed as he flipped through the documents, realization dawning in his expression. "You mean," he looked up at her, eyes wide. He had no right to sell me this house? She nodded. And if he took money from you, you have every legal right to go after him. The buyer sat back, stunned. Oh, he muttered. Oh, this is going to be fun. Her husband's phone must have been ringing off the hook by now. She could almost picture his smug face twisting into confusion as he realized something was terribly wrong. The buyer was angry, his girlfriend was probably panicking, and soon, the reality of his situation would hit him like a freight train. She could have sent him a message. She could have called to tell him exactly what had happened. But where was the fun in that? No, she wanted to see his face in person when the truth finally set in. She wanted to be there when his arrogance turned into sheer terror. And that moment was coming soon, sooner than he ever expected. Her husband had always been careless with money, but he had never been outright reckless, until now. As she sipped her coffee, she scrolled through their old financial records, looking for any sign of where he had stashed the money from the sale. If he had received a deposit, it had to be somewhere. She doubted he had the intelligence to hide it properly, but even if he had tried, there would be a trail. And once she found it, she would make sure he had nowhere to run. She checked their joint bank account again, nothing. That meant he had set up something separate, possibly with the help of his girlfriend. Smirking, she opened another tab on her laptop and started digging. If he had made even one mistake, one tiny slip, she would find it. And judging by his history, it wouldn't take long. She didn't have to wait long for the first domino to fall. That evening, while she was going over documents, she got an unexpected call. "You don't know me," the woman's voice said, hesitant but urgent, "but I think we need to talk. It's about your husband." That got her attention. "Who is this?" she asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Someone he's been lying to," the woman replied. "Can we meet?" Curious, she agreed, setting up a meeting at a quiet restaurant downtown. When she arrived, she spotted the woman immediately, young, well-dressed, but visibly shaken. As soon as she sat down, the woman leaned in and said, "He told me you were crazy. That you were refusing to sign the divorce papers. But now I think he's the liar." She smiled to herself, settling into her chair. "Tell me everything," she said. The woman, Olivia, was exactly what she expected, naive, but starting to wake up. Olivia had been under the impression that her husband was a wealthy, successful man starting fresh after a toxic marriage. He had fed her stories about a bitter, vengeful wife who refused to let go, twisting the truth to paint himself as the victim. But now, with the house sale falling apart, Olivia had started questioning everything. "He said the house was his," Olivia muttered, running a hand through her hair. "He even showed me fake documents." "I thought," she trailed off, looking humiliated. She almost felt bad for the woman, almost. But Olivia had played her role in this mess, knowingly or not. "Don't worry," she said smoothly. "You're not the only one he's lied to. But if you want to make this right, you need to help me." Olivia swallowed hard before nodding. "What do you need?" Olivia handed over her phone, showing her messages with him. It was worse than she thought. He hadn't just lied, he had outright manipulated Olivia into helping him move money. The texts revealed everything: where he had stashed the deposit, how he had planned to convince the buyer to pay in cash, and even his strategy for dodging legal trouble if things went south. He had been so confident, so sure that no one would figure it out. She took screenshots of everything, forwarding them to Chloe. "This is exactly what we needed," she murmured, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in her chest. Her husband had thought he was untouchable. He had believed that he could take everything from her and walk away unscathed. But the noose was tightening, and soon there would be nowhere left for him to run. She ignored every call, every text from her husband. By now, he had to know that something was wrong. The buyer was furious, Olivia was no longer on his side, and the walls were closing in. And yet, he still hadn't figured out just how much trouble he was in. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of hearing her voice, not yet. She wanted him to stew in his own panic, to wonder what was coming next. Instead, she focused on what mattered. Chloe had already reached out to the authorities, preparing to file a formal complaint about the fraudulent sale. The buyer had agreed to cooperate, furious that he had been deceived. Everything was lining up perfectly. And her husband? He was spiraling, but he had no idea just how much further he was about to fall. She didn't have to wait long before Olivia texted her again. "He's freaking out," the message read. "Says he needs to talk to you. Begged me to reach out." She smirked, taking another sip of her wine. It was exactly what she wanted. He was desperate now. He thought he could smooth talk his way out of this like he always did. But this time, there was no escape. "I'm not interested," she replied simply, setting her phone down. Let him sweat. Let him lie awake at night, wondering when the other shoe would drop. Because when it finally did, it would be swift, merciless, and completely deserved. The next morning, she finally drove back to the house. Parking down the street, she watched as her husband stormed back and forth on the porch, his phone clutched in his hand. He looked disheveled, stressed, completely unlike the smug man who had called her days ago, laughing about how he had destroyed her life. Now, he was the one who looked ruined. She took her time getting out of the car, making sure he saw her approach. When he did, his eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in anger. "We need to talk," he snapped, marching toward her. She just smiled, tilting her head. "Oh, I know," she said coolly. "And I can't wait to hear what you have to say." He crossed his arms, trying to regain some of his old confidence. "You've made this way more complicated than it needs to be," he said. "You're only hurting yourself." She laughed at that, an actual, full laugh that made his expression falter. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "You have no idea what's coming." His face darkened, but before he could speak, she pulled out the paperwork. His eyes scanned the documents, his expression shifting from irritation to panic. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's proof," she said smoothly. "Proof that you never owned this house. Proof that the sale was never legal. And proof that you, my dear, are in a world of trouble." He was still reading, his hands trembling slightly. "That's not possible," he muttered, shaking his head. "That's not, oh, but it is," she interrupted, stepping closer. "You see, you signed away your rights to this house months ago. You just never paid attention. And now? Well, now you've committed fraud." The color drained from his face as he realized just how deep he was in. He had thought he could get away with it. He had thought he had won. But instead, he had walked straight into his own downfall, and she was going to make sure he felt every single second of it. For a moment, he just stood there, gripping the papers as if holding on to them would somehow change the reality of his situation. His jaw tightened, and she could see the gears turning in his head, desperately searching for a way out. But there was no escape. Not this time. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind nothing but a man who had dug his own grave and was only now realizing how deep it was. He swallowed hard, his voice no longer smug. We can fix this," he stammered. "We don't have to involve lawyers. We can work something out." She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Fix this?" she echoed. "You mean after you laughed in my face and told me to enjoy finding a new place to live?" His face flushed, and he opened his mouth to argue, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "No, we're past that. You made your bed, and now you get to lie in it." His hands trembled as he flipped through the papers again, his breath growing uneven. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing. And the realization that he had played himself was finally setting in. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. The buyer, now fully aware that he had been conned, marched up the driveway, his face a mask of fury. "You lying piece of garbage," he spat, shoving a folder into her husband's chest. "You took my money for a house you didn't even own?" Her husband stumbled back, his face paling further. Look, this is a misunderstanding," he tried, but the buyer wasn't having it. "No, this is fraud. You stole from me." She crossed her arms, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Her husband had been so confident, so sure that he could pull this off. But now, with the buyer demanding his money back and the legal consequences looming over him, he looked nothing like the man who had called her days ago, laughing. He was unraveling, and the best part? This was only the beginning. The buyer leaned in, his voice cold. "Either you return every cent, or I take this to the police. And trust me, you do not want that." Before her husband could stammer out another weak excuse, the front door swung open, and Olivia appeared on the porch. She looked between them, her expression shifting from anger to horror as she pieced together what was happening. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her husband turned to her, desperation in his eyes. "Baby, I can explain," he started, but she shook her head. "Don't. Just don't." Olivia turned to her, her face filled with regret. "I had no idea he was doing this," she said quietly. "If I had known," she held up a hand, stopping her. "You were just another pawn in his game," she said. "But now you know what kind of man he really is." Olivia's gaze hardened as she turned back to him. "You used me. You lied to me. And now? You can rot." With that, she walked back inside, slamming the door shut behind her. And just like that, he had lost everything. The commotion had drawn the attention of neighbors, and soon, people were gathering outside, whispering among themselves. She could see them exchanging glances, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the once smug man now standing in the middle of the mess he had created. Someone pulled out a phone, likely recording the spectacle, and she knew this would spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Her husband seemed to realize it too. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. His failure was on full display, and there was no way to spin it. No way to charm his way out. No way to shift the blame. He had humiliated her, mocked her, tried to strip her of everything she had built. And now, he was the one standing in the wreckage, exposed for the fraud he truly was. The weight of his downfall finally hit him. He turned back to her, his hands shaking. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I messed up. But we can fix this. We can, she raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her eyes. We, she repeated, letting the word linger in the air. You think after everything you've done, after the way you laughed in my face, that I would ever help you? His face contorted, a mix of anger and panic. I don't have anywhere to go, he admitted, his voice cracking. I lost everything. I don't know what to do. She stared at him for a long moment before stepping closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. That's not my problem, she said softly. You wanted me gone. You wanted me to suffer. But look who's suffering now. She turned away, walking back toward her car as he stood frozen in place. The buyer was still there, glaring at him, and from the way her husband's shoulders slumped, she knew reality had fully settled in. He had nothing left. No house. No money. No girlfriend willing to stand by his side. And now, he was facing legal consequences that he couldn't talk his way out of. She reached for the car door, then paused, looking back at him one last time. Enjoy finding a new place, she said, throwing his own words back at him with a small smirk. Then, without another glance, she slid into the driver's seat and drove away, leaving him behind in the ruins of his own making. The days that followed felt lighter, freer than she had expected. The house was still hers, legally and completely, but she no longer saw it as the place she had once cherished. It was tainted by his betrayal, his lies. And now that he was gone, she realized she didn't need to hold on to it any longer. Selling it on her terms, for the right price, felt like the perfect way to close this chapter of her life. She spent the next few weeks tying up loose ends, making decisions that were fully her own for the first time in years. It was liberating. No longer burdened by his selfishness, his recklessness, or his arrogance, she could finally focus on herself. And for the first time in a long time, she was truly happy. Her ex-husband didn't just lose everything, he was forced to pay back every dollar he had stolen. With the buyer taking legal action and fraud charges looming over him, his life crumbled even further. She heard through the grapevine that he had tried to find someone else to bail him out, but no one was foolish enough to trust him anymore. His reputation was ruined, his finances wrecked, and his arrogance shattered beyond repair. As she stood on the balcony of her new apartment, a glass of wine in hand, she thought back to the moment he had called her, so sure that he had destroyed her. And yet, here she was, stronger than ever, while he was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The thought made her smile. He had thought he had won. But in the end, she had played the long game. And she had won it all.